Yeah.
Thank you, Kathy. And thanks to everyone for coming this evening. I'm Janell Brush. I'm an associate research scientist with FWC. I'm also a member of the Florida Shorebird Alliance partnerships in Florida, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. I am going to talk about, if I can get this to work, hold on. Okay. I'm going to start today by thanking many groups of folks that I've had the opportunity to collaborate with and receive support from over the last 17 years of working on American oyster catchers in Florida. And in particular, I wanted to give a shout out to these folks who really dedicated countless hours to monitoring research and protecting American oyster catchers in Florida. So I'm going to start at the beginning, just a little bit of an overview for those of you who aren't that familiar with American oyster catchers. They're long-lived shorebird. For example, the literature says they live upwards of 17 years old. The bird in this picture is a banded bird. It was the first bird we've ever banded in Florida. We banded it along the Amelia River, and this bird was banded in 2008, and this year it will be 16 years old. So they have really strong wintering and breeding site fidelity. For example, this bird in particular, once it was old enough to breed, it started breeding along the Tolomato River. And for the last 13 years, it has bred in exactly the same spot on a shell rake along the Tolomato River every single year it is there. So really strong breeding site and wintering site fidelity for these birds. They're stateless and is threatened in Florida because they have a really small breeding population, and we've had observed population declines. And because of that, every single nest site is important, as are the conservation of roosting sites. So they're dependent on coastal areas that support intertidal shellfish beds, and some common prey items for the oyster catchers, of course, are oysters, as well as mussels and crabs. And they often select roosting and nesting locations that are adjacent to prime foraging habitats. So the group of oyster catchers I'm going to talk about today is a subspecies that breeds and winters along the US Atlantic and Gulf coasts. I'm going to start by talking about the group of birds that winters in Florida and what we've learned about this segment of the population. So every 5 years, Manomet conducts a range-wide count of the American oyster catcher population, and that includes adults and subadults, and they count them when they're flocked up on their wintering grounds. So their survey route looks something like this. And the first survey they conducted for the oystercatcher population was in 2003. And last year, they conducted a survey again, and they recorded 14,735 total adults and subadults in this entire area, including Florida. And this was an increase of the population of 43% in the last 15 years. This is an incredible story of species population growth due to coordinated conservation efforts through the American Oystercatcher Working Group and dedicated resources for improving reproductive outcomes for oyster catchers range-wide. This is, for a shorebird species, showing a population recovery is not something that we see very often. So this is really a monumental feat that this group has been able to achieve. And in Florida, last year when they did this survey, there were about 3,935 birds that were wintering in Florida. That was 27% of the entire population in their range. They counted wintering in Florida. So let's dive into this number a little bit more about Florida. So we've got the range-wide 14,735. We've got the Florida population. And within Florida, the majority of those wintering birds were documented in the southern nature coast in 3 counties. In fact, in those 3 counties, 21% of the entire population of oyster catchers is documented wintering. And that's broken up between Levy, which is Cedar Key, Dixie, and Citrus County. And Levy in particular, that is the largest concentration of wintering American oyster catchers in their entire range is in Cedar Key, Florida. So it's pretty, as far as conservation of oyster catchers goes, it's a very important site for wintering oyster catchers. So what does this look like when you're out there? So this is a shell rake that a partner of ours, Pat Leary, staffed this picture in 2021. At the time, this one shell rake had 5% of the entire population of American oyster catchers on it. One shell rake outside of Cedar Key. There were 658 birds on this one site. And so the question is, what do we know about these birds? Well, we have documented these birds that were wintering in Florida are coming from breeding sites up north. And we know this because of some banded birds. So some of the birds wintering in Cedar Key are coming from New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Massachusetts, Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and breeders from Georgia and Florida are also wintering in Cedar Key. And it's great because these programs have initiated these banding programs. These states have initiated banding programs so that we can learn more about demographics, movements, and habitat requirements for the oyster catchers. And it's all coordinated through the Oystercatcher Working Group. So let's go back to look at the picture that I have, another picture at Cedar Key. This particular roost at the time of this picture had 510 oyster catchers. But within that flock, we had 50 banded birds from 8 different states. So it's nice to have these banded birds. They're field readable. I know probably many of you on the call have seen banded birds, but this one flock had 50 banded birds from 8 different states. It's very important conservation-wise that all of these birds are ending up wintering on the same roost in Cedar Key. So let me tell you a quick story. When I started working at FWC back in 2006, I was the first person that was tasked with shorebird and seabird research in the Research Institute of FWC. And I attended my first Oystercatcher Working Group meeting where I met colleagues from up and down the Atlantic coast. And what I didn't know is my management colleague at the time, Nancy Douglas, had prepped them for my arrival. And while I was at that meeting, every single person that has birds that winter in Cedar Key managed to corner me and ask me how their birds were doing. So I had no idea how their birds were doing, but I knew it was important for me to learn. And I knew the answers to this question might be linked to oysters. So I turned to my friend and colleague, Peter Frederick, who many of you may know as the incredible avian ecologist that he is. But by the time he retired as a professor from UF, he was also known as the king of oyster restoration. And what Peter and his colleagues were learning about oysters in the Big Bend, and I'll just, interchangeably call it Big Bend and Nature Coast, it's the same general area in Florida. But what they were learning was that there was a 66% net decline in the extent of oyster reefs since 1970, that 88% of that loss was to these offshore reefs. But there was no apparent shortage of oyster larvae in the nearshore ecosystem. And so it was within the rapid decline of the extent of these oyster reefs in this region could really have significant effects on these winter oystercatcher habitats, what they're dependent on in this area. But it was within these habitat mosaics, it was unclear what habitat features were used most by oystercatchers for feeding and also for roosting. So we collaborated and launched a project to describe the importance and function of foraging and roost habitats for wintering American oystercatchers, and to identify any factors that might be limiting for this wintering population. And the project results were published in the journal Estuaries and Coasts. But in summary, what we learned was birds that winter in Cedar Key are fat and happy. So 95% of the prey items that they eat are oysters. And I think we had about 3% that were unknown, possibly oysters. So they're eating oysters when they're wintering in Cedar Key. And we determined that they only needed to forage about 37 minutes a day to satisfy their daily energy needs. And that is actually probably biased high because it was based on energetic needs of a breeding bird. And we didn't have the information for a wintering bird. So basically, at the time of the study, they weren't currently limited by prey availability in Cedar Key. And I have to say that I presented this recently, this slide, and somebody in the audience had a really perplexed look on her face for the rest of my talk. And at the end, she threw her hand up and she said, "How are they shucking oysters so fast?" And I giggled and said, "Okay, they're fat, happy, and they're lazy because they don't typically open oysters. They wait for them to go underwater and then they just pull out the meat." So 37 minutes of lazy foraging per day to satisfy their daily energy needs. But what we did find out was that this group of birds is really limited by high tide roosts. So these offshore reefs are declining in extent and they're eroding at accelerated rates. And at the time of the project, there were only about 10 offshore reefs that were optimal for high tide roosting locations for oystercatchers. We did document 2 that were only used at night, which was interesting. But they tend to select offshore reefs that are mostly free of vegetation, that offer a 360-degree view of approaching predators. And we predicted that if oystercatchers are forced to use suboptimal roosting locations, that there could be survival and energy costs associated with the increased predation, of course, as well as the increased anti-predator behaviors. And they also face further competition for optimal high tide roost sites as human recreational use of the area continues to increase over time, as well as if you've ever been out at Cedar Key at a high tide, there's not a lot of land that's exposed at high tide. So what is exposed, everybody wants to go to. And this is not including the big islands. Those are not the habitats that they use as high tide roosts. And the other fun thing that happens sometimes is when they get to share their roosts with their fancy new visitors, like what happened after Hurricane Idalia, you get an increase of well-intentioned people to document this incredible endeavor with these flamingos. But what they don't know is that there's also a large population of wintering oyster catchers. And if they get flushed, then sometimes this happens. It can lead to birds getting taken by opportunistic predators like peregrine falcons. So the second phase of this project, we selected 2 of these high tide roosts, these critical high tide roosts, to enhance to benefit wintering oyster catchers through a habitat enhancement project. And it was a very small scale habitat enhancement project. But the design of the roost project was adopted from some of the earlier restoration strategies that from the University of Florida pilot projects that Peter and his team had implemented that were aimed at restoring intertidal oyster reefs, which incorporated the use of locally available materials like limestone rock and shell. And the project was completed in 2017. So the restored reefs were in rapid decline from erosion and oyster mortality, and we were able to increase reef area, elevation, and oyster resettlement through the project. And the project areas have withstood several storm events, including Hurricane Hermine, which occurred right after we finished, and more recently, Idalia. And we had the opportunity to collaborate with the University of Florida and the Cedar Key Aquaculture Association to really involve the local aquaculture farmers to obtain and distribute materials to the restoration sites. And involving the Cedar Key community with this project really helped stimulate the local economy, and it helped develop support for the project and for American oystercatcher conservation in the area. This group of folks have been working side by side next to oystercatchers, and now they have a better understanding of how important the area is for the oystercatchers. And we really increase the support for oystercatcher conservation in the area by involving them in the project. So at this point, so now we are armed with the oyster research and what we know about oysters in the area, which is incredibly valuable. And we have the information about the preliminary information about how the wintering birds are doing in the area. But what we still didn't know was what were the potential costs if high tide roosts were unavailable for oyster catchers. And fortunately in the area, like I referenced before, we have this incredible tool in our analysis toolbox of these abandoned and recited birds in the area. And so we were able to pull 12 years abandoned bird recite data from the database that the American Oystercatcher Working Group manages. And most of that data, I would say probably 97%, was collected by Doris and Pat Leary, who we've been working really closely with over the last 17 years to collect this valuable information. And so with our data set in hand, we needed to think about our question about what might be affecting annual survival of these wintering birds. And over the years, we've had the opportunity to document many things that force these birds off of these critical high tide roosts, and opportunistic documentation of disturbance and airboats and tour boats and people in general that are recreating that just don't know that they're there. And we tried really hard to figure out a way to quantify disturbance, but because it's not consistent, we're not able to document it effectively over time. We started thinking harder about what else causes birds to get flushed off of their roosts. And the answer was water does. And so in Cedar Key, there's a NOAA tide station near Cedar Key. And within Cedar Key, within a 24-hour time frame, most often have 2 high tides and 2 low tides. The second high tide is called the higher high tide. And so we use the data from the NOAA station, and we called that higher high tide the maximum daily high tides. So bear with me, I'm going to show you a couple of graphs, but I'm going to work through them very slowly, and it's good information. So we use the maximum daily high tides. We took 40 years of maximum tide data from the winter, and then we discovered there's this break point that occurs when maximum high tides became abnormally higher. And once we figured out that breakpoint, we used 30 years of data prior to that breakpoint to calculate what we called an average annual winter maximum daily high tide. And we called this normal. Prior to the breakpoint was normal to come up with this average maximum daily high tide moving forward. So for the years after the breakpoint, we looked at the number of hours the maximum winter high tide was greater than that normal value. And we called this roost inundation risk. So we quantified the duration roosts were likely inundated during extreme high tide events, which could translate to birds being forced to use these suboptimal roost habitats with the increased risk of threats to survival. And the annual survival estimates from the model range from 0.86 to 0.96, which is very similar to estimates calculated in other oystercatcher populations. However, we documented a 7.3% decline in survival from 2007 to 2018 and an average annual decline of 0.6. So we found support for our hypothesis that the frequency of extreme higher high tide events negatively influence survival. And we recently published this work in the Journal of Wildlife Management. And something to think about is that the population dynamics of long-lived species like the American oystercatcher are really sensitive to changes in adult survival. So we documented this decline in survival throughout the study period, which can negatively affect range-wide populations if the decline is sustained. So we started thinking again about what we can do to help conserve these habitats that are absolutely critical for this wintering population of oystercatchers. And restoration is key. To enhance these offshore roost sites might help mitigate population level impacts of sea level rise. And at any restoration or enhancement project in the Nature Coast Big Bend area, oysters are going to be key to mitigating habitat loss. As architects of the estuary, a healthy oyster can outpace sea level rise. And so this research led to the designation and protection of high tide roosts as critical roosting sites and FWC's imperiled beach nesting bird guidelines for state listed shorebirds and seabirds, which includes the oystercatcher. And this is a regulatory framework that provides legal protections for listed species and their habitats. And these high tide roost sites around Cedar Key are the only critical roosting sites included in the imperiled beach nesting bird guidelines because of how important they are for a large proportion of the range-wide population and because of the research that we did to document this. And the other thing is that we're working really hard to build a constituency of public support for American oystercatcher conservation in the Nature Coast. People don't realize how important this area is for oystercatchers, and it's likely also really important for other shorebirds. That's why I put the other bonus picture in here for y'all. But the projects that get implemented in this area that benefit the oystercatchers also benefit a suite of other species that either stop over or winter in the Cedar Key area. So I'm going to pivot abruptly from talking about the winter population to talking about our local breeding population. And again, I'm going to start at the beginning with a little bit of information about breeding oystercatchers. So they initiate breeding at 3 to 5 years old. They primarily nest on shell rakes and small islands. However, they do also nest on spoil islands and beach habitats and even on rooftops in Pinellas County. So they breed from March to August. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second. They're very territorial, solitary nesting shorebird. They don't want to be around any other oystercatchers. And they have semi-precocial chicks, and that means that the chicks are mobile upon hatching, but completely dependent on the adults for food and protection. And what's unique to the oystercatcher is that even when the chicks are flight capable, they're dependent on the adults for food for at least 3 weeks, sometimes quite longer. And they're very much a management dependent species like most other shorebirds and seabirds that we have in the state. And I want to go through a couple slides really fast just to put this into perspective about this management dependent species. I know people say this about shorebirds and seabirds all the time, but the oystercatcher is a really good example of why. So I said that March to August is the nesting season. That's how the nesting season is. But because oystercatchers really want to nest in the same spot every year, and they're really territorial, they often show up January, February, March, upwards of 60 days before they even lay an egg, so they can secure their territory that they had last year. And we know a lot of this information because of the unique banded birds. So we are documenting birds coming back to exactly the same spot every year, year after year to nest. So they show up January, February, maybe March, depending on where you're at the state. They just defend their territory for 60 days. And then March, April, they start laying. Incubation time is about 30 days. And then you move into, if they're successful, then they move into brood rearing and feeding. That's about 35 days. So assuming they haven't failed yet, they've been at their nest site for 125 days. And then we move into the immature post fledgling care, where they can fly, but they can't feed themselves. And that's a minimum of 25 days. And they tend to stay through all of this, they tend to stay in the same location in general where they were nesting. And so at this point, the total time at a nesting site for an oystercatcher in Florida is 150 days in a single location in our coastal environment. And I don't know what could possibly go wrong if you're stuck in one spot along the coast for 150 days. But it's a huge challenge for oystercatchers to be successful. They are a management-dependent species. And fortunately, we have a lot of coordinated conservation to implement strategies and mechanisms that protect nesting birds and mechanisms that we know work and are sustainable. And a lot of that in the state of Florida has to do with the Florida Shorebird Alliance. And so realizing that the conservation and management of these oystercatcher and other shorebirds and seabirds is really beyond the reach of any one agency or organization, the Florida Shorebird Alliance was created and formalized to coordinate conservation actions and expand resources. So the Florida Shorebird Alliance is a statewide network of conservation partners that are really committed to advancing shorebird and seabird conservation in Florida. And I'll run through a little bit more about it, and then I'll go back to the oystercatchers. So we currently have more than 35,000 subscribers to the monthly Rackline newsletter that we call the Rackline. And the membership for this has grown over 70% since 2017. And this portion of the Florida Shorebird Alliance conservation community includes people who may not actively participate in on-the-ground conservation, but they're affected by conservation activities, and their buy-in is absolutely crucial to the population recovery of beach nesting birds. So being able to openly communicate through the newsletter provides a really accessible way for open dialogue with these really important stakeholders. So this is the largest group of the Florida Shorebird Alliance. And we also have a Florida Shorebird Alliance Facebook group that has over 2,800 members from over 40 countries, which is a nice resource for folks to just get involved and figure out what's happening in Florida. We have the Florida Shorebird Alliance website. It's packed full of resources and information for partners. And then we have a much smaller group of what I call Florida Shorebird Alliance partners, and they make up a statewide network of local partnerships that coordinate on-the-ground protection of shorebirds and seabirds. And this group is composed of concerned scientists or concerned citizens, non-government organizations, government agencies, educational institutions, businesses, basically a lot of folks, and very diverse. And unlike many other imperiled species recovery efforts, the Florida Shorebird Alliance is unique in that it's the sole organizing body that coordinates shorebird conservation in the state of Florida. So if there's work being done on the coast for shorebird conservation, it's done through the FSA network. And, you know, shorebirds face a multitude of challenges you can only imagine, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of this stuff, but our partners really undertake a multifaceted approach to addressing these challenges. And there's numerous things that these partners engage with, from posting to stewarding to monitoring breeding birds. And I'm going to give one example, and I know y'all are going to Fort DeSoto in a month and you're going to check out the warblers, but I encourage you to head to North Beach because it's a pretty incredible location. And this is an example of our Florida Shorebird Alliance partners coming together and putting their heads together to implement strategies to reduce human disturbance, and to include posting, stewarding, educating the public, coordinating with law enforcement. So they're in the loop on the birds are nesting and when they're nesting, as well as frequent monitoring at the site that really informed, you know, when to go out and steward and timely management and conservation actions. And they dedicated over 300 hours to educate over 1,500 people at this one site. And you can see in the picture how well this is working. You have the posted area, you have all of the people on one side. For those of you who haven't been to North Beach, this is pretty typical. on any day during the summer, and you have the oyster catcher with their chicks in the front. And the year that this picture was taken, they successfully fledged all 3 chicks in this habitat with chicks running around and being crazy. It was monumental feat. And I will still have to channel one of our FSA partners who said she wanted to give credit to the adults as well, because they made sure that all 3 chicks had equal amount of food, which is kind of unheard of. So anyhow, this is just an example of what we're able to do when we work together as part of the Florida Shorebird Alliance on some of our busy beaches. And I encourage you to go out there when you go warbling, just take a break. All 5 of our state focal species nest on between Outback Key and Fort DeSoto. So you can go out there with your binoculars, and if you go at the right time, you'll probably see chicks running around. So I encourage you to check it out. Anyhow, back to breeding American oystercatchers in Florida. This map gives you a general distribution of where they're nesting in Florida. This data is from 2022. Florida has the 3rd largest concentration of breeding oystercatchers in their range. They're 3rd behind Virginia and North Carolina. So we have 458 breeding birds. That's 229 pairs. And within Florida, the largest concentrations are located along the Tolomato River in St. Johns County, at on the Spoil Islands at Marjorie Harris Cross Florida Greenway Park, Spoil Islands in Citrus County, St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge, Lanark Reef Critical Wildlife Area in Franklin County, and Cedar Key. And I'm gonna pivot and have some fun just to show you the difference in habitats through some of these areas. So I'm going to start really quick on the Tolomato River. Here's 2 examples of nesting along the Tolomato River. There are 2 nests in these pictures, and if you're really keen and you can get really close to your computer monitor, you might be able to see that they are here and here. And one thing about some of these sites where oystercatchers nest is you have a shell rake with 1 oystercatcher nest on it. And we don't always post every oystercatcher site because the greatest threat to nest success isn't always people. It isn't always disturbance. Sometimes it's avian predators. Sometimes avian predators key in to a sign equals an oystercatcher nest. So a good rule of thumb that I always say is if you're out recreating in the Florida coastal habitats during nesting season and you see 1 or 2 oystercatchers, it's very likely they have a nest, even if you don't see a sign. And if you see a sign, they might be nesting even though you don't see them. So we'll do another one. This is another Tolomato River nesting habitat picture. I promise you there's 3 eggs in this picture. And if you see them, let me know later because I might hire you to do some monitoring. But there's the nest, really well hidden, which is great to avoid predators, not great for someone who doesn't want to step on an oystercatcher nest who happens to be walking on the shell rake. And we'll go to Cross Florida Greenway Spoil Islands in Citrus County. For those of you who've been out there, it's limestone based for the most part. And there's a 1 egg nest in this picture, very well hidden. And if you're fishing around the islands, this is sometimes what you see. What you may not notice is there's a chick with these 2 adults. And I threw this in here just because I think it's an incredible picture of a nest, and it gives you an idea of the habitat differences where they might nest at St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge. And this is also St. Mark's. And so this little island is typical of some of the habitats they nest at St. Mark's. And this island was much bigger before Hurricane Michael came through. And they're still hanging on to this site, hoping they don't get overwashed. Lanark Reef, there's a chick in this picture. And this is my good example of how important critical wildlife areas are. This particular critical wildlife area has a year-round closure posting in the water so that boats don't land, because it's in this particular picture, we've got a baby oystercatcher hunkered about where you would land your boat. And the adults are just hanging out watching. They're not calling or freaking out. You would never know this oystercatcher chick was here unless it's nesting season, you happen to see the adults. So all good just ideas of diverse habitats that I find folks don't realize oystercatchers are nesting basically anywhere in the coastal environment. So back to this, we've got our largest concentrations, and I just showed you pictures of most of them. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the nesting concentration at Cedar Key. So there's 18 breeding birds, 9 pairs at Cedar Key. It's the 5th largest nesting concentration in their range. And their nesting habitat characteristics, it's characterized by They use the smaller islands and shell rakes. They're higher in elevation than the surrounding area to offer an optimal view of potential danger. They nest adjacent to oysters for easy access to foraging, and they often select areas that have at least a little bit of sparse vegetation, so to offer shelter from inclement weather and cover for the chicks and cover from predators. And in the Cedar Key area, they don't nest on the big islands. They tend, and even the smaller islands like Rattlesnake and McClamry, for those of you who are familiar with Cedar Key, they don't nest on the main island typically. And some of that is because if you're out there, that the sandy areas are where people want to be. So they head straight for the sandy areas. There's also more mammalian predators closer to those trees. So they tend to nest in the fringe habitats, the marshy habitats, the shell rake habitats. And the areas, even within Cedar Key, look very different, depending on where you're at, as far as the sites that they'll select to nest. And the nest site in particular also is incredibly diverse. You've got sandy substrate with mangroves, and then you'll have just your shell or a high tide rack line that they will nest in sometimes. So what we've been able to document is a lot of different threats to nesting success in Cedar Key and the rest of Florida, but this is pretty typical. You've got your mammalian predators, you might have people and, once in a while, maybe a helicopter landing in your nesting area. It is Florida after all. But we were able to bring in, collaborate with University of Florida co-op unit and bring in a master's student to dive a little bit deeper into some of these factors that are limiting reproductive success of oystercatchers at Cedar Key and also at the Barge Canal Spoil Islands. And so Nick Vitale came on, and we had been documenting nest overwash opportunistically as the primary threat to oystercatcher nest success in the Cedar Key since we had begun regular monitoring. And he was diving a little bit deeper into what some of the secondary threats were in the years where they didn't get overwashed. And his project was really focused at those spoil islands as well. There was a lot of unknowns at the time related to why nests weren't doing well at the spoil islands. But what he did document was he confirmed the 2 years that he did his study that a lot of the nests were overwashed. So 46%, that included renests, of all nests in Cedar Key were overwashed for those 2 years he was there. And that is actually biased low. It's probably much greater than that because we only count a nest if there's an egg on it. And at some of the sites where they're nesting, they're getting overwashed before the team has time to go out there and document the nest. So they're getting overwashed sometimes every time they lay an egg at the next high tide cycle, they're getting overwashed. The good news about Cedar Key is that if those eggs hatch, we have really high chick survival. And once they fledge, survival to 60 days is usually 100%. And again, they're in Cedar Key. We know that the wintering birds are there for a reason. There's really good food, there's good shelter. And the breeding birds are also, once they have the chicks, they're also reaping those benefits of having that great forage base there. But the tricky thing that we've been noticing in Florida is we've been putting a lot of energy toward increasing productivity and reproductive outcomes for oystercatchers. So now we have a lot more oystercatchers in the habitat, a lot of young birds that are 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, and they're of age to enter the breeding population, but they don't have any habitat. And so high chick survival and high reproductive success doesn't always lead to increased size. So our state listed threatened population isn't necessarily growing the rate that we think it would because we're growing chicks. So the piece that's missing is that we are literally watching nesting islands disappear. And this is statewide. I'm going to talk about Cedar Key, but this is happening for oystercatchers because of where they select to nest, almost statewide. So this is an example of that. This is Derrick Key. It used to be the largest nesting concentration in Cedar Key. It had consistently 5 pairs, and we literally watched it go underwater in less than 10 years. I snapped this picture one time when I was out fishing because I couldn't believe it was Derrick Key, and there was still some remnant trees. But the oystercatchers have such strong nest site fidelity that they were literally trying to nest on Derrick Key as the island was being overwashed through every tidal cycle. They were still there trying to nest. And this is another visual of what this area looks like over time. And you're losing the oyster reefs, which we know Peter and his team have documented that, but we're also losing nesting islands because they were previously buffered and protected by these oyster reefs. So we documented, Nick was able to quantify this loss of the breeding habitats for the oyster catchers in the area. And we published this in Estuaries and Coasts in 2020. And in summary, the total area of all islands used by nesting oyster catchers around Cedar Key decreased by 39% between 1974 and 2016, with 85% of this decrease occurring after 1995. So the timing of the accelerated erosion of Cedar Key Islands closely follows that of the losses of oyster reefs in the area, suggesting the reefs were indeed stabilizing the islands. It's all about oysters in the Nature Coast. And so Derrick Key, you can see in this graph, that's the island that I showed you that was underwater. And we have another island that I'm going to talk about, Gomez Key, which is following the same trajectory. It's not that far behind Derrick Key. This is what Gomez Key used to look like. And it's Gomez Keys on every navigational chart that you have. It says Gomez Keys, but right now we're down to Gomez Key. It's been reduced dramatically over time. It used to have a hard time even getting to it because it was surrounded by oysters. But Gomez Key, what's left of it, is an incredibly productive site for oyster catchers in the entire Nature Coast. So 5 of the 9 pairs of breeding oyster catchers in Cedar Key nested on Gomez Key last nesting season. And productivity is the number of fledged chicks per nesting pair. It's a metric that we use to gauge reproductive success. And the oyster catcher working group has a productivity goal for range-wide productivity at 0.4 chicks per pair. And when they get above 0.5, range-wide, we're growing the oyster catcher population. And they have hit that, and which has been, the result has been that growth that they've documented over time, range-wide for the oyster catchers. And the Florida population, during the same time frame, was 0.32 chicks per pair. But Gomez Key is consistently contributing to high productivity rates. And a fun story about the number of pairs, you can see it increase from 2022 to 2023. And that's not very common because they're very territorial. At the end of the nesting season last year, where 1 pair was renesting and 4 had chicks, they actually let another pair in to nest, which we had never documented anywhere in Florida, and they were successful. And so it's birds are just ready to go there and nest if there's even a little bit of space, which is pretty cool. So long-lived birds, and Gomez Key, it's incredibly productive. So they fledged 13 chicks in the last 7 years at 0.45 chicks per pair, just for Gomez Key. So one of the traits for long-lived birds is that they often have, and they can have, many years of low success. As long as they have a great year every now and then range-wide, we can be documenting population increases. At these smaller scale, sites that are consistently producing chicks at rates like this are incredibly rare and very important for maintaining the local, state, and range-wide populations. Most sites in Florida, for example, are really lucky to have pulses of success every 3 to 4 years. So Gomez Key is one of the most consistently productive and largest concentrations of breeding oyster catchers in the state. And I have one fun fact, just because it really tells the story of how important this island is when you can tie it to a single bird. This bird was banded as a chick on Gomez Key in 2015. It actually started breeding at 2 years old, which typically they breed between 3 and 5 years old. And it entered the breeding population at Gomez Key, the same place where it was born. And since then, it's produced 8 fledglings in 7 years. So, and it nests in exactly the same spot every single year on Gomez Key. So very important island, and we have very productive birds that are nesting there. And it's a little deceiving because if you go out there, let's say, for example, in the winter on a low tide, you can still see the historic footprint of the island. So the island looks much bigger than it is. You have these expansive mud flats, and you see the historic island footprint. But if you go during the nesting season, what you see is what's on the right. So just this tiny little strip of land, and all of your birds are packed in there, which is why I said it's one of the densest concentration and most productive concentrations of oyster catchers nesting in the state, because the island really, the area that's still available to them is really not that big, and it is still definitely prone to overwash. And so we were able to get to initiate a project, Gomez Key Habitat Enhancement Project. And it was really the work that Nick did that really propelled this project to the top of the list of projects that were potential projects to receive Deepwater Horizon funding. And it was his work plus the work that the Oyster Group had done to show that there's if you build it, they will come. And oysters are definitely key in any restoration project in Cedar Key, like I said before. So this is a NERDA-funded project with the goal to restore and conserve oystercatcher nesting and foraging habitats. And Joe Marchionne, he's with FWC, and he's also the project manager and a UF graduate student who's working on the project. And we had the opportunity to work with some incredible engineers from multiple groups to really come together and collect a ton of data to figure out how we can reverse this decline for this island. And time is ticking, especially when you get storms like Idalia coming in, like what happened last year. We don't have much time left for Gomez Key. And the two main objectives for restoring Gomez Key involve improving nesting habitat and food resources for oyster catchers. So we knew this project, in order for this project to be successful, we need to incorporate these nature-based restoration strategies that expand and elevate potential oystercatcher nesting habitat, that prevent further erosion, promote oyster recolonization, and support really the entire ecological community at Gomez Key. And we had the opportunity because just north of where Gomez Key sits was a very large scale intertidal oyster reef restoration project called Lone Cabbage. And the design of the Lone Cabbage Reef project informed the design of this nature-based feature breakwater that's going to be part of the Gomez Key project. And we were able to adjust the structure of it in a way where we added slope and features to reduce scour. And that's really to help maximize the ecological benefits via water exchange to promote oyster growth between the breakwater and the island, because we wanted to have a large expansive foraging area for the oyster catchers and an area for oysters to reestablish and help buffer the island. We also reduced the size of the limestone to reduce oyster predation by crabs. And so we have finalized our project design. We're currently in the permitting phase of the project. And, you know, in addition to habitat restoration and enhancement along the nature coast, breeding habitats are also currently being protected, again, by the imperiled beach and bird guidelines. So like the critical roosting sites, oystercatcher breeding sites are included in FWC's imperiled beach and bird guidelines for state-listed shorebirds and seabirds. And again, this is a regulatory framework that provides legal protections for listed species and their habitats. And so the active recent breeding sites are any site that was recorded in any of the preceding 5 consecutive breeding seasons. So all of the important nesting sites in Cedar Key are part of this. And again, I'm going to go back to stakeholder support. You know, we really are working to build a constituency and awareness of how important this area is for wintering and breeding oyster catchers, and support for the conservation and restoration work that we know we need to do in this area to sustain the population of oyster catchers in Florida and range wide. And so, you know, part of me coming today is to really let you all know about how important Cedar Key is, and to share this information with folks to really get some more momentum to support oystercatcher conservation in the nature coast. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much. I think you're still there.
We're still here. Thank you so much. So we have a few questions, and then more people, feel free to add your questions to the chat. So we had a question on how large is a pair's nesting territory?
No, we haven't measured it, and they're variable. And part of the reason why it's hard to measure is often like along the Colorado River, you have 17 miles where they're nesting, and each shell rake has a pair. And so there's not 2 pairs on any shell rake. So it's a little bit tricky because they don't really like to tolerate each other. I think, you know, Derrick and Gomez Key are 2 good examples of where they do. I think there's some of the Tampa Bay islands that I think they tolerate each other. They if their nesting habitat is good and foraging is good, the territories seem to be smaller. but we haven't actually quantified that. We just know that they'd rather be apart unless the conditions are really good, and then they will tolerate each other to a certain extent.
Okay, and we had a question about the overfishing. So is it natural or man-created, for example, with boats? So
The
overfishing.
for the oysters.
I guess overfishing, the
Overwashing, Kathy.
overwashing. Okay,
Oh,
sorry.
okay. So can you ask the question one more time?
I asked if the overwashing is natural or if it was created by boats, but later on you explained that it was the hurricanes and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And probably the global warming too.
Yep, exactly. That sea level rise is what we were able to quantify, that increase in the higher high tide every day over time. That's what we've, I will note though, because in other places, overwash due to boat wakes is an issue. And like in South Carolina, where they're nesting along one of the main channels, boat wakes is a really big issue for oyster catchers nesting there. So we're fortunate that it's not an issue in Cedar Key, but it easily could be, and it is in some areas for sure.
And we had a question about Red 64. Is Red 64 female? She said, I think I can see her eye fleck.
That's a good question, and I think that she is. She's also larger than her mate, which tends to be kind of indicative that that she's the female. But yeah, I think I could probably find a picture with the eye fleck, and it's not 100% accurate, but I do believe that she is the female in the pair. Yeah. Someone knows their oyster catcher biology.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions? You can type them in or you can just say them. You can unmute yourself. You can put your camera back on. You gave a lot of great information, Janelle. Thank you so much.
That was incredible. This is Cherry Patillo, and there was so much information. You're an incredible speaker. I really appreciated all the background and the research and all the steps and the people involved to have gotten to this point. I noticed in your first, I think it was the range distribution where it went all the way over to Texas and along the East Coast. I noticed there was a section of the blue line that did not include Southeast Florida. But yet later in some of your information, I did see the 2 nests. So was that map done before those 2 nests were found?
So are you talking about the winter range-wide survey with the blue line?
Yes.
I actually was hoping that somebody would catch that. So when Shiloh flew this last time, Shiloh Schulte is the biologist from Animet that does the flights. We coordinated with folks, especially in the Lake Worth Lagoon. They did on the ground surveys and they incorporated that data in his survey. There was the inclement weather and some logistics that were that were challenging. So he wasn't able to fly that southeast corner of Florida, but we coordinated with Florida Shorebird Alliance partners on the ground to incorporate their ground counts into the count. And when he does the flight, we have folks on the ground in Florida to help figure out his detection. So he's counting with binoculars. He's also taking pictures. And then we have folks on the ground to verify how many they had on the ground versus from the plane. So yeah, that was included. And there are definitely wintering birds in Southeast Florida. Not as many as Cedar Key, but they're still noteworthy. And especially Lake Worth Lagoon, they've been cranking out lots and lots of birds in Lake Worth Lagoon recently. It's a really productive site. So there's a lot of birds wintering down there.
Well, thank you. That's great to hear. And I'm glad I picked up on that.
You did. I thought maybe somebody would. So yeah, good job. You're right.